Hello, friends. The topic under discussion today is William Butler Yeats and Introduction. It is necessary for us to get familiar with the personal life of William Butler Yeats because his poetry is quite subjective. There are personal references in his poems. William Butler Yeats was an Irish poet and he was born on 13th June 1865. And he was one of the foremost figures of 20th century literature. A pillar of the Irish literary establishment, he helped to found the Abbey Theatre and in his later years served two terms as a senator of the Irish Free State. He was a driving force behind the Irish literary revival, along with Lady Gregory, Edward Martyn, and others. He was born in Sandymount, Ireland, and educated there and in London. He spent childhood holidays in County Sligo and studied poetry from an early age when he became fascinated by Irish legends and the occult. These topics feature in the first phase of his work, which lasted roughly until the turn of the 20th century. And the Sligo place itself is very many times mentioned in his poems, especially Lake Isle of Innisfree. He began writing his first works, when he was 17. Although Yeats' early works drew heavily on Shelley, Edmund Spenser, and on the diction and colouring of pre-Raphaelite verse, he soon turned to Irish mythology and folklore and the writings of William Blake. In later life, Yeats paid tribute to Blake by describing him as one of the great artificers of God who uttered great truths to a little glen. In 1891, Yeats published John Sherman and Thoya, one a novella, the other a story. The influence of Oscar Wilde is evident in Yeats' theory of aesthetics, especially in his stage play, and runs like a motif through his early works. The theory of masks developed by Wilde can clearly be seen in Yeats' play, The Player Who. Yeats had a lifelong interest in mysticism, spiritualism, occultism, and astrology. He read extensively on the subjects throughout his life. He became a member of the paranormal research organization, the Ghost Club, and was especially influenced by the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. As early as 1892, he wrote, "If I had not made magic my constant study, I could not have written a single word of my Blake book, nor would the Countess Kathleen ever have come to exist. The mystical life is the center of all that I do and all that I think and all that I write." His mystical interest formed much of the basis of his late poetry. His first significant poem was The Island of Statues, a fantasy work that took Edmund Spenser and Shelley for its poetic models. The piece was serialized in the Dublin University Review. Yeats wished to include it in his first collection, but it was deemed too long and, in fact, was never republished in his lifetime. Quinn's books published the poem in complete form for the first time in 2014. Now, there are very many characters who had a deep influence on him, on W.B. Yeats. And one such prominent character is Maud Gonne. In 1889, Yeats met Maud Gonne a 23-year-old English heiress, an ardent Irish nationalist. She was 18 months younger than Yeats and later claimed she met the poet as a paint-stained art student. Gone admired, Yeats began an obsessive infatuation, and she had a significant and lasting effect on his poetry and his life thereafter. But Yeats' love was unrequited, in part due to his reluctance to participate in her nationalist activism. In, and that is the reason why Yeats, in his poem, A Prayer for My Dear Daughter, again and again advises his daughter not to have any strong opinion about anything. In 1891, he visited Gone in Ireland and proposed marriage, but was rejected. He later admitted that from that point, the troubling of my life began. Yeats proposed to Gone three more times, and in 1899, 1900, and 1901. She refused each proposal, and in 1903, to his dismay, married the Irish nationalist Major John McBride. His only other love affair during this period was with Olivia Shakespeare, whom he first met in 1894 and parted from in 1897. Yeats derided McBride in letters and in poetry, and that we'll find in our poem A Prayer for My Daughter. Gone's marriage to McBride was a disaster. This pleased Yeats, as Gone began to visit him in London. In 1916, Yeats was 51 years old and determined to marry and produce an heir. His rival, John McBride, had been executed for his role in the 1916 Easter Rising, so Yeats hoped that his widow might remarry. His final proposal to Maud Gonne took place in mid 1916. Gonne's history of revolutionary political activism, as well as a series of personal catastrophes in the previous few years of her life, including chloroform addiction and her troubled marriage to McBride, made her a potentially unsuitable wife. Biographer R.F. Foster has observed that Yeats' last offer was motivated more by a sense of duty than by a genuine desire to marry her. Yeats proposed in an indifferent manner with conditions attached, and he both expected and hoped she would turn him down. According to Foster, when he duly asked Maud to marry him and was duly refused, his thought shifted with surprising speed to her daughter. Means he even wanted to marry Morgan's daughter. The next important character in Yeats' life is Georgie Heidi Lee. She was his wife. That September, Yeats proposed, that means in 1916, Yeats proposed to a 25-year-old Georgie Heidi Lees, known as George, whom he had met through Olivia Shakespeare. Hyde Lees accepted, and the two were married on 20th October. Their marriage was a success in spite of the age difference. The couple went on to have two children, Anne and Michael, although in later years, Yeats also had romantic relationships with other women. And it is for his daughter Anne that Yeats wrote the poem A Prayer for My Daughter. He had also written the poem A Prayer for My Son. In 1896, Yeats was introduced to Lady Gregory. She is the third important lady, Olivia Shakespeare being one, she is the fourth. By Yeats was introduced to Lady Gregory by their mutual friend Edward Martin. This Lady Gregory, was his patroness. Gregory encouraged Yeats' nationalism and convinced him to continue focusing on writing drama. Yeats was close to Lady Gregory, and her home place of Cooley Park, Galway, he would often visit and stay there as it was a central meeting place for people who supported the resurgence of Irish literature and cultural traditions. His poem, The Wild Swans at Cooley, was written there between 1916 and 1917. Yeats was also awarded Nobel Prize for Literature. In December 1923, Yeats was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his always inspired poetry, which in a highly artistic form gives expression to the spirit of a whole nation. He was aware of the symbolic value of an Irish winner. So soon after Ireland had gained independence and sought to highlight the fact at each available opportunity, his reply to many of the letters of congratulations sent to him contained the words, I consider that this honor has come to me less as an individual than as a representative of Irish literature. It is part of Europe's welcome to the Free State. Yeats was also involved in politics. He was an Irish nationalist who sought a kind of traditional lifestyle articulated through such poems as The Fisherman. However, as his life progressed, he sheltered much of his revolutionary spirit and distanced himself from the intense political landscapes until 1922 when he was appointed senator for the Irish Free State. Now we come to the style of Yeats. Yeats is considered one of the key 20th century English language poets. He was a symbolic poet, using allusive imagery and symbolic structures throughout his career. He chose words and assembled them so that, in addition to a particular meaning, they suggest abstract thoughts that may seem more significant and resonant. His use of symbols is usually something physical that is both itself and suggestion of other, perhaps immaterial, timeless qualities. Unlike other modernists who experimented with free verse, Yeats was a master of the traditional form. Yeats wrote the preface for the English translation of Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali, which is called Song Offering, for which Tagore received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Now we come to his old age and death. By early 1925, Yeats' health had stabilized and he had completed most of the writings for a vision. Towards the end of his life, and especially after the Wall Street crash of 1929 and Great Depression, which led some to question whether democracy could cope with deep economic difficulty, Yeats seemed to have returned to his aristocratic sympathies. During the last 5 years of his life, Yeats found a new vigor evident from both his poetry and his intimate relations with younger women. During this time, Yeats was involved in a number of romantic affairs. Yeats died at the Hotel Ideal César in Menton, France on 28 January 1939 at the age of 73. He was buried after a discreet and private funeral at Rockerbourne, Cape Martin. Attempts had been made at Rockerbourne to dissuade the family from proceeding, with the removal of the remains to Ireland due to the uncertainty of their identity. Yeats and George had often discussed his death, and he expressed his wish. His express wish was that he be buried quickly in France with a minimum of fuss. According to George, his actual words were, "If I die, bury me up there at Rockerbrunn, and then in a year's time, when the newspapers have forgotten me, dig me up and plant me in Sligo." In September 1948, Yeats' body was moved to the churchyard of St. Columba's Church, Drumcliff, County Sligo, on the Irish Naval Service corvette Alimacha. The person in charge of this operation for the Irish government was Sean MacBride. Who he was? He was the son of Morgan MacBride and then Minister of External Affairs. So, since now we are familiar with his personal life, it would be easy for us to understand his poem, to understand his preference for a traditional family, traditional values, aristocratic family, and a balanced life, and his strong aversion to women having a strong opinions, because all the roots of all these things lies in his history. So in our next lecture we'll continue with W.B. Yeats' poem, A Prayer for My Daughter. Thank you.